Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us on a wonderful conference. I think today's session on democracy and open data, I think has many different angles that we want to look at. When we think of democracy, we're thinking of the public good. We're thinking of the rights of citizens. When I personally think of my own journey in using open data as a commercial programmer, as a technologist, not really thinking about the greater impact of the information that we're dealing with, but certainly dealing a lot with privacy. We think of democracy in the action we can use data for. It always first has to be in an environment where we're protecting privacy, but we also look for ways that we're enhancing our prospects. And those prospects could be personal, they could be communal, or they could be business. One of the things that I've always valued very much in the open data society is that we don't just focus on the academic function, we don't just focus on government and governance, but also on the private sector. And so we have a great mix today with Carmela, Dr. Carmela Cucuzzella, who I will congratulate you, my friend, for recently accepting the permanent appointment for professor at Concordia University. Her focus as the Concordia University Research Chair in Integrated Design, Ecology, and Sustainability for the built environment. And this is a very clever and interesting way to look at the use of data in the public space, and with individual projects that you'll walk us through, some student projects that really focus in on how the individual can confront information. After that, we're going to introduce and then hear from Jan Kestle, who's the president of Environics Analytics. She may claim that she's only had boring statistics jobs in the past, but I think your experience is quite rich and broad. And in fact, Environics Analytics is one of the largest providers of data to a variety of governmental levels and academic institutions in Canada, always focusing on both enhancing the prospects of individuals as well as protecting their rights and privacy. So first, over to you, Dr. Cucuzzella. We'd love to hear from you, just a little introduction of yourself, and tell us what you're working on lately.
Is the slideshow going to start now or no? Yes?
Yes, we do have a slideshow for you. Would you like us to bring that up?
Sure, that would be good.
Yes,
okay, thank
you.
Thanks. So my name is Carmela Cucuzzella. As you said, my background is very varied, and I work in a department of design and computation arts. And I do have a first degree in computer science, worked in telecommunications for over a decade. And then I got another degree and a master's and a PhD in design and environmental design and architecture studies. So it explains a little bit of my kind of very broad way of looking at things. So just to let's get right to the project of my students. So it's been a couple of years now that in my one of my studio courses, I've included the City of Studios Challenge, which is a brand new thing for us at Concordia. Well, brand new thing. It's a couple of years that we have it. A model that we've taken over from the City of Vancouver, which allows universities and pedagogy to be confronted with real municipal questions that are brought to the students, and then the students take over those questions as pedagogical exercises. So this year, the City Studio Challenge that I chose for my students was about the open data. And the data charter that was just developed by the City of Montreal. But specifically, I asked the students to work with the open data of the City of Montreal. More specifically, I asked the students to use the available open data that is available to us through the very open portal, even though not many people know of that portal that's available to everybody. And they had to choose one of those kinds of data that the city offers, and look at that data and ask themselves, how could we design public spaces using this data in order to create a more resilient city and improve civic engagement? So the idea more specifically was, first of all, how would they organize that data? How would they use that data in this public space project? How would this data be made available to communities so that they know that such data is being collected by the city and therefore they know it through this public kind of relationship and dialogue that they will eventually have with this project. And so how could we also demonstrate the usefulness of this collected data by the city? And also the most specific one is how could we ensure that this data can support the city's challenges? And right now, much of the city's challenges have to do with, sustainability, the next, thinking about the city of the future. So I just show you briefly some of the projects that, in the next few slides, I'll show you some of the projects. Obviously, right now, I'm just showing you the final posters, so it's going to be very difficult. But what I'll do is I'll just give you a kind of synopsis of each of the projects. So here we have a project that was proposed and which won one of the prizes at the City Studio Challenge. Is a project that uses the data that is collected by the Sector Info Collect, which is about the garbage that's collected in the city of Montreal. And it's an animation of food falling from the top of a building, which illustrates the increasing garbage. Then there's a little QR code that you don't see on this poster, but it's actually there. And if people looking at this projection go on that QR code, go on that site, and start interacting with that site, all of a sudden the waste of this projection will start getting smaller and smaller because the projection knows and the application knows that people are interacting with the projection and not just passing by. And so the idea is to really understand how many people are looking at this, going to the QR code and trying to understand how garbage collection is taking place in the city of Montreal. On the right side, you have something called the Everyday Exhibit. It's really a project that tries to democratize the data that is not necessarily collected by the City of Montreal, but nonprofit organizations surrounding the City of Montreal on public art. And so it allows people to be more aware of all the public art that's in and around the city. So I'm only going to give you a little bit. For example, on the right side, we have something called The Good Neighbor. The Good Neighbor is an application that uses data that's on Yelp. But sometimes data on Yelp is not complete, especially for the small and local businesses. So it's an application that also allows people that are seeing this app that is sitting in the public space to put their own businesses in there. And so the idea here is to enable local shopping to be able to have more sustainable, not only economic but also just growth in the city. So lastly, I'm going through these quickly because I have a very limited time. Lastly, I'm going to show you this other project on the right side, which is called Green Buds. It's a project about collective gardening to make Montreal greener. What this app does, it tries to connect users from all over the city with the goal of making Montreal greener by creating a community of practice around the question of urban agriculture. So the application implicates a twofold process of data. One, that is about the existing data in the city on the locations of established urban agriculture projects that already are there. And the second one is to add the opportunities that keep growing that in either public or even private spaces that allow for collective urban growth. So it offers a fair and equal access to both information opportunities and food access from gardens, regardless of income, social status, and location, which is definitely a problem in the city of Montreal for some areas where there are some food deserts. So this is really kind of the type of projects that were developed. I mean, I could go on about the broader research project that I have surrounding these questions, but I will leave it at that for now, and I'll wait for the discussion to unfold. And I'm very happy to be part of this panel. Thank you. I can't hear you.
You're on mute, Bob.
Okay.
Thank you. What's so interesting and compelling in the student projects, and I've had a chance to review some of them in more detail, is the excitement that's gathered when an individual is confronted with, well, I didn't know this data was available. Now it's available. What could I do with it? And the clever problems that they're seeking to solve are quite interesting. So we'd love to hear more about these as the discussion unfolds. Over to you, Jen, as we look at your role in really your role on a national stage to help provide data that powers many of the decisions that businesses make and that many government entities make and contribute to that, has put you in a position to interact, on the national data strategy to really promote the concept of how does how does open data answer a business problem for us? And for all of us, the growth of the business sector and the support of that is key to our own democracy and be able to forge our way of life. Would love to hear more about your thoughts and maybe some of your observations on what it's like to work across multiple agencies and companies.
Great. Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here. It's always great to interact with a group of people who really think that data are very important and in fact important to democracy and to making our lives better. And so all of the topics that you're wrestling with and the great examples that Carmela just showed us reinforce the fact that data are really, really important to a civil society and to good government and to a healthy economy. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I've been working with data on a national scale for about 5 decades. The first couple of decades of my career, I worked in the Ontario government in the small statistical agency in the province. And everyone knows that statistics are a federal responsibility. But in every province, there's a group that works on statistical priorities and manages statistical policy relationships between federal and provincial governments and do other kinds of statistical functions. And I had the opportunity to work in that environment and eventually lead that environment for Ontario. And although it was many decades ago, it really gave me a lot of insight into some of the challenges in what we would call the national statistical system. And today's not the day to talk about sort of federalism, but one of the challenges in data and data sharing and data access and data quality revolve around the fact that very important data are collected and mandated and organized by different levels of government. And for all of us in the research community, academic and business community, we understand that that presents some challenges. And I had the opportunity to understand a little bit about what the challenges are and how we might address them. The next part of my career has been working for private sector firms who produce data, what I would like to call value-added data on top of government data, and bring together data from disparate private sector sources, so survey data and administrative data and census data, et cetera, bring it together to create what we would call integrated products so that people have data that they can actually go and use. And I did that for some of you who might be old enough to remember a company called CompuSearch, which was the first company that took data from Statistics Canada and created reports for retailers. Before we had GIS systems and before we could really do automated things, we built reports for retailers and banks and so on. And then 17 years ago, I founded Environics Analytics, which is a company that had a specific mandate to produce data and information to help solve business problems. And Environics Analytics has been around for almost 18 years now and is the largest provider of data and information to a large number of businesses, but not just businesses. We also provide data to not-for-profits and governments and other organizations that are really trying to understand how to make data-driven decisions. And we do a lot of work. I guess I feel a little bit, I don't want to be defensive, but I feel a little bit like, well, I'm the private sector person here, and sometimes our data aren't open. But we make a really big effort, as do many other research companies, to work with the colleges and universities and the research networks and the government researchers, because Canada's a small country with limited resources, and there's lots of work that needs to be done, and I think it's a partnership game. So I'm very pleased to be able to talk about how public and private sector organizations can work together to ensure that we are data-driven and that we really are using facts to make decisions. The last thing I'll say about my own career is I am a member of the Canadian Statistics Advisory Council, which is an appointment of 9 individuals from across the country who are appointed to advise the minister responsible for Statistics Canada and the chief statistician on the health of the national statistical system. So once again, we don't focus on Statistics Canada only. We focus on how can all of the people who are really concerned about being data-driven help the government develop policies and procedures to ensure that data are really at the heart of what we do in Canada. And so in that role, I've had the very exciting opportunity to really think about things like privacy and the data strategy and how public sector and academia and researchers and governments can collaborate. So I don't have slides because I kind of feel like the last 18 months it's been death by PowerPoint. So I wanted to talk to you about a few issues. As far as the kinds of cool things that we do at Environics Analytics with data, I suggest if you really want to see some of the kind of mashup of data from different sources, both open and public sources and other sources, go to the current CTV website, because we've been producing reports for their section on elections. So there's a recent report that shows at the riding level the sort of change in income pre and post COVID. That's an example of creating up-to-date income, reconfiguring it by geography, putting it into software, and being able to turn it into some kind of easy-to-use, actionable insight. There's also a piece there that shows just taking some recent survey work from over the past weekend and turning it into a bit of an analysis, again, at the riding level of where people are likely to vote by mail. Now, these kind of data are not sort of research data that come off the shelf. They come from a significant amount of modeling, integration, and combining data, methodology, and software. And so I encourage you to take a look to see that the result of bringing different kinds of data together and trying to understand the problem you're trying to solve is a really important part of making data useful to democracy. In that context, I just want to finish up my opening remarks by talking about three things. First of all, I'm a supporter of open data, and I think data are very important to democracy, but I also think that all kinds of data are very important. So it's not a yes, but it's a yes and. Open data are very important, and the work that's being done with open data and the efforts of governments and other kinds of organizations to make data available to researchers, I've supported those initiatives my whole life. But I also understand that some people don't have the capacity to take raw data or just the data that's available. And the way that businesses and other organizations integrate data and add value to it, fill in missing values, project data forward, understand how data from different sources can be incorporated. All of this work, we spend millions of dollars in our company doing that. So try not to be biased to think the only data is the free data, because, first of all, businesses are willing to share those kinds of data with the academic community for research purposes. And there is a need for Canada to invest in quality data that can really answer real world problems. The second key point is, even though we're talking about data, it's not really data that people need. What people really need is information. And information comes from understanding the problem you're trying to solve and looking at data sources, and then understanding what the right methodology is to use those data to answer the questions. And I think sometimes we forget about the importance of methodology. And so one of my key concerns is that as data become democratized and technology becomes so available, we also have to make sure that there are standards, because at the end of the day, we want to be data-driven. We want to be fact-based. So, anybody can get can download R and download some data, but what should you do with the data, both from an ethical point of view, but more importantly, what should you do from a quality point of view, has to be very, very much a part of the conversation of how we're going to become a more successfully data-driven society. Next point I think I've already made, which is there is a role for the public and private sector to collaborate, but it's not easy to do. And it's not easy for academia and the broader research community and the public sector with different levels of government and businesses to collaborate. So when we hear about the national data strategy and we hear about wanting Canada to be more data-driven, we have to overcome the barriers in doing business together. We have to cut red tape. We have to identify problems and work together to solve. Because part of the recovery from COVID is to become more and more competitive. The economic recovery has to be data driven. We have to make choices. And finally, I really want to just share my thoughts about why this is such an important public policy issue. Data do make people's lives better. We understand about education. We understand about healthcare. We've seen in the past 18 months how important it is to have good data about healthcare and how many gaps there are. We know that it's important for social justice and dealing with diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we actually can measure special populations and that we can be sure that those data are of good quality. So filling in data gaps and ensuring quality and ensuring that a data strategy isn't only taken over by technology, but the methodologists and those people, particularly the researchers on this call, understand that we're not just producing data, but we're producing high quality data, is a very important part of ensuring that data serves our democracy. And on that point, I would say that the data community has to be a better advocacy group for helping your average Canadian understand. Canadians are asked to provide their data to governments, both through surveys and censuses and through administrative data. And there's kind of this public sentiment right now, probably not the majority of people, but that suggests that, we really shouldn't trust our data to people. But we need to be data driven. So we need a dialogue about the balance between the need for data and why you should be willing to share your data with organizations that are ethical, that are governed by PIPEDA, that are governed by the Statistics Act, and why there should be no contradiction to giving data that's going to be used by responsible organizations to serve the public good. There's no contradiction between that and protecting personal privacy. There's many bad actors out there and we hear about the breaches and we hear about the challenges, but the data community needs to help the average Canadian understand why data are important to the betterment of their lives. And so finally, there is a role for governments in the data strategy, in the work on becoming more data-driven. Role for Statistics Canada, a role for provincial governments, a role for privacy offices to ensure that people give their data and it's used for the purposes for which it's intended. But we can't have a society where data aren't shared and data aren't used in order to make people's lives better.
Right.
That's me.
Some powerful, powerful statements, Jen, and I appreciate it. We're going to touch on some of these as we move into the next section. And we've really broken this session today into three buckets. Each of us has spent a little time kind of positioning ourselves and what's important to us. I'd like to ask both of you some directed questions to kind of get all of us thinking here, really as preparation for what I hope is a vibrant, open discussion. So I'm going to invite the attendees to, in the chat on the Hopin platform, to post some questions for Carmela and for Jen or for me that we might address as we kind of together wrestle with the democratic ideals. I wanted to key on one thing that you talked about here, Jen, and it's this idea that there's open data, and then we have public information, and then we have commercial companies that do it. There's another one that I don't think we always think about as much, is that personally provided information from an individual citizen is something that doesn't necessarily fit any of those molds. So think of things I type into a form, or in certain ways, the Government of Canada collects information about businesses that might be self-reported. And those are interesting ones because there's an honest question as whether or not that's open or closed, or is part of the public domain, or is just my personal information. Carmela, I was really teased and interested in a particular project you described recently where people were given an opportunity to explore their own data. And this was more dealing with pollution and some other items, but I'm wondering if you could share the specific installation project where we had individuals able to interact with their own, I want to say carbon footprint, but their own impact on the environment. And let's talk a little bit about whose data is that. But first, tell us about that project a bit. I think it's very clever.
Well, okay, I'm not, because there are many projects that, first of all of the projects were touching some kind of ecological footprint because my course is History and Theory of Sustainable Design. And so they were all. But in some cases, because the students were actually asked two things. They were asked either use open data that is available by the city, and then when the city came in, they understood these different categorizations of public data and open data, because the students were asking, for example, could we have data of the amount of energy that is used within a building? This way we can display personal energy uses of. No, you can't do that. No, that's not possible because that's illegal, and it's you won't be able to do that. But there's another project that was quite interesting, which was the opposite. So in other words, what they did was they collected data from the city regarding how much energy of each borough is using, for example, on a weekly basis. And then what they did the reverse. At night, there were a whole series of trees that were powered by solar energy that would be more lit in those boroughs where less energy was being used. So in my area of research, I call this eco-didactic design in the public realm. In other words, where designers actually make an effort to place an eco lesson in the public realm regarding some data and therefore some truthfulness. So there's truthfulness in that eco lesson that is not just a kind of manifesto of some kind. There's like real truthfulness underlying that data. But a lot of the data is not real time. So I try to actually give my students a difference between real time data and non-real time data, because there's a big difference too in terms of how you can mobilize citizens and civic society in terms of sustainability and their behavior. I'll give you another example, and this will show you the difference. And so, for example, there was another project in California called Particle Falls, and this is not from my students, but some of my students did use it as a source of inspiration, where what they did was they installed a series of sensors in some of the most busy corners in the San Fernando Valley. Everybody knows that that's one of the areas in California with the highest concentration of automobiles. And so the idea was to be able to measure the toxicity level in all of these corners, and there were projections made to the buildings, to one of the buildings in that corner, in each of those corners. And in one case, there was a waterfall that was beautiful if the toxicity was very low, and became very agitated and looked like smoky if the toxicity was very high. And there were, information panels for passersby to understand what it meant, what the projection actually meant. This was a real-time projection, which meant that people could actually use this information as a way to decide a course of action. So in other words, they could use it to decide whether they go inside because, the air is too toxic, whether they decide, look, I have to find other means of transport and mobility, or whether they should be wearing a mask, or all kinds of other options, or just completely ignore it and just continue doing what you're doing. But at least the information is there in real time so that citizens have that available to them, which is a health-related issue. And we can go on and on in terms of how those kind of interventions in the public realm that place eco lessons directly there for people to use. It could be real time, like this Particle Falls example. It doesn't always have to be real time. It could be kind of collected and then displayed, because the idea is to still show on an ongoing basis certain information that communities would like to know to be able to readjust themselves for the future of their behavior, because everybody's learning in this kind of climate change phenomena. Everybody's learning. Obviously, organizations need to figure it out too, because that's where a lot of it happens. But because climate change is kind of a hyper object, by that I mean it's everywhere in time and space, meaning that you can't locate it anywhere. It's important that everybody has a way to contribute to it as well.
Yeah.
So this is So these are the kind of reflections that we do as a researcher. I mean, I can go on and on talking about how researchers have been doing, not researchers, artists and designers have been thinking about, eco art in the public realm in ways to be able to educate communities for like 3 or 4 decades now. But it's just more recently that data became a big part of that design and art because because we have it. Number one, we have it accessible to us now, and it puts kind of a bigger punch in the message. It's not just someone's personal project of anxiety. It's really, this is what's happening across the board, so it's embedded in reality and fact, so that's an important part of it.
Yeah, it's quite a compelling story. I wish I could see and learn more about that project. Is that something that you can share with us? How we might find out more about this? What was the name of it again?
The one in the San Fernando Valley was called Particle Falls. Okay. Particle Falls by a company called Particle Works. So you can find it and it was around 2010. But I could identify all series. There was one project called 1,000 Steps Broadway, which an urban designer called Mary Miss organized as a public space installation along Broadway Street. This was embedded in non-real-time data. So what she did was she installed a whole series of informational kind of panels with mirrors that were pointing to elements in the city that were causing the biodiversity to degrade in the city. And then she had these panels that said how that is happening based on data. And then she would have walking tours and she would walk around Broadway to do this. So there's all kinds of ways that artists and designers can help activate that data. That's what I call it in my class. Activate, mobilize that data to make it known. And of course, this is other kinds of data, but it's data nonetheless.
Yes.
So,
well, it's very interesting. And I think, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jen.
No, I would just like to also hear, for example, Jane in that perspective, because I know that you look at data from a very different perspective, but I'm fascinated by the kind of rigor that you have in the way that you address the question of data, which is the key part now. Right now, we're in that phase. We need to be able to show everybody that the data is factual, because we're in a very strange societal space right now. You know?
Remember the old books on how to lie with statistics. You like I said, you can get a small number of bad actors, and then thinking about data strategy and being data driven, we have to think about methodology and best practices, and that's the job of the people on this call. That's our real mission, is to be sure that analytics and research are done properly. But I want to go back to Bob's original question as well. Like, when you give data to a company that you do business with, you give your name and your address and fill out information about your family status, and they have information about how you transact with them. That's, kind of consumer data. And then there's data that private sector survey companies collect, and then there's data that governments collect, and then there's data about you that go into administrative databases, like, when you have your COVID test, it goes into a provincial health database, and then finally, there's all the breadcrumbs that you're leaving with your cell phone and walking around and location turned on. And I think that how to determine, what of that is open, it really depends on your definition of open. Question is, what can be open? In other words, what could be made available to researchers to use these kinds of data for good? So number one, when you fill out a census questionnaire or a labor force survey, the Statistics Act enshrines in Statistics Canada the right to collect data from individuals that are important for the well-being of Canada. And it's your legal requirement to provide data for certain kinds of mandated data activities to the government. But at the same time, the government has a requirement to ensure that those data are collected under the Act and that your confidentiality is preserved. So that's an example of it, a kind of an exchange that takes place. Once those data are collected and organized for the purpose for which it was intended, then much of that data now, in recent decades, becomes available through open data, not the data that the individuals have provided, but data that's been anonymized, aggregated, and released as open data for the use by researchers. When someone participates in a survey, the first thing that happens when you either do a survey online or you're dealing with a private sector for the survey company, they ask you if you're willing to participate in a survey. And your data is not kept as an individual, but it's kept as a representative sample person. And so again, there's an exchange there between you and the person you're providing data to. When you provide data to your bank or a retailer, you're signing, some kind of commercial agreement with them, and you're saying, "I'm going to give this information to you about me." And what PIPEDA says, it says, "I expect you to use this data in a reasonable way, in the way that a reasonable person would expect." It's not quite those words, but the word reasonable is in there twice. And then finally, we're doing a lot of work right now with what we call passive measurement, where we actually do look at, who goes into a store, what phone goes into a store, and how many times it goes past an outdoor board, and for transportation planning, what the origin and destinations are of cell phones. Except what we do is we move the common evening location of the phones to the nearest postal code. And then we make sure that in any kind of analysis that we do with this passively collected data, which people can scrape from the web or buy from aggregators who do that, we make sure that the data are aggregated, anonymized, and de-identified in a way that they can't be re-identified. Now, this still gives really good data. You'll have some expert modelers who, for their own reasons, will say, "Oh, well, that's not real data." But if you have hundreds of thousands and millions of observations from passively collected data, and you are a responsible firm that's making sure that there's no activity that can be identified back to an individual in what you produce, or that there's no reasonable way for those data to be re-identified, in other words, anonymized, aggregated, with no identifiers, then those kinds of data can be really useful to the research community. And some of that data from government sources can be made available in open data. And from other companies like ourselves, you have to pay for it, but it's still part of the modernization project in general for the data community. Statistical organizations all over the world, both public and private sector, know that consumers really don't want to sit and fill out what they spent their money on last week over and over in detailed diary surveys. And they don't want, they want the government to use data in a responsible way that the government already has. So there's a balance between, when you're collecting data and when you're using data, you have to honor, the data scientists and the data users have to honor the part of the trust exchange that you're having with citizens and with consumers. And if we do that and we help people understand that better, then we'll have more usable data, and we'll have more data that we can make open and available. And of course, it has to be accompanied by research data centers and I know there's challenges there, so I don't want to get everybody's back up, but the data have to be made available, but they have to be made available with best practices and with the protection of citizens. And
Yes.
Canada's actually a world leader in this. We may think we have problems, but Canada is viewed as one of the leading countries in the world in terms of how we manage data and how we organize it and how we're attempting to modernize our statistical systems.
Yes. So a brief aside. So we started our company 6 years ago with a focus completely on open data. We had a chance, as an American, I had a chance to open the business in the US or in Canada. And we specifically chose Canada as our headquarters because of the openness of the data sets that were here. We felt like it would help us build early on, which is good. We're starting to get some questions in the chat, which is great. And I want to encourage a few others to ask those. So we'll present those in a moment. One thread I wanted to pull on just a bit, Jen, is you mentioned the concept of location information. And certainly today, location information isn't directly made available at an individual or a precise level, any more precise than a home or a location. But I wanted to pose this question to you because it's something we wrestle with as a commercial company. There are ethical and non-ethical ways to use data. There are ways to follow the rules or break the rules, and the technology enables all of that. And really, the question is simply this: if my mobile device can carry information about my location, it's perceived to be anonymous. What we've seen in several examples recently is that it's quite clear how you could take an individual anonymous mobile location and you could combine it with other data sets, including open data sets, and then use that to pinpoint or de-anonymize an individual. There have been a couple of high profile cases of that. Um, it's difficult to confront for a bunch of reasons, and privacy chief among them, except in at least some of the cases, you could make the argument that the unearthing of an individual was actually supporting something positive for society, or some might think so. So supporting the democratic ideal of doing good for the populace could put us in a position where sometimes we think data should be closed, and sometimes we might actually prefer that data should be open, even though it might bend the rules of privacy. In our own company, we have a very strict set of rules on what we're allowed to do and not, primarily because our customers demand it of us, and we know it's the right thing to do. I wonder if you could explain just a little bit more. I know you anonymize location data at Environics. Are there other examples of things that you do to kind of put stronger guardrails around your use of data that might cause concern?
Sure. I mean, I think that you have to err on the side of caution. And what's very important, location data picks up either a GPS or a cell signal of where a phone is at a certain point in time. And those data can be scraped or they can be purchased. But how you locate people geographically depends on the precision of the satellite and the precision of the towers. At our company, no matter what the level of the data is that can be purchased or acquired, we aggregate it and move it from a precise home location to its nearest, say, postal code in an urban area, so that you're not really looking at the activity of the phone that lives here, 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 and here, but the activity of a group of people who live in that area. And our statisticians and modelers have to ensure that any data, number one, that we buy like that comes de-identified, and then that's if we're buying it from outside suppliers, because we don't do any of this direct collection ourselves, but we buy it from suppliers. And then that we aggregate it to the lowest level of groups that is required in order to really ensure the privacy and the lack of possibility of re-identification. That's what we do in Canada, because that's what the law requires, but also because that's what consumers and citizens expect. And then finally, because as statisticians, we believe that in the aggregate gives you at least as good and sometimes an even better result, because you're aggregating data together to look at trends. So it's a myth to say that, we need to track every individual in order to get a good statistical result. And it's very important that we don't mess up this whole progress towards being data-driven by putting any issues of consumer or citizen trust at risk, because we need people to want to give data under the right circumstances so that we can make better decisions about what needs to happen.
Yes, that's wonderful. Wonderful. So, folks, we're getting notice that we're about to head into a 15-minute break. So, I'd just like to ask Carmela for you to sign us off. Such a wonderful way that you communicate the value of data to the citizen and to your students. Give us a final word, if you would, as we head off into the next session.
I would like to highlight, and my students would be that my students love that project, because they're kids of the data society. They absolutely adore that project because all of a sudden they say, oh, that's where all that data can be used in a good way for civic society. And don't forget, the students are taking a sustainable design course. So they're already people that want a better city. Okay, so all of a sudden they are, and the whole process is fun because they learn something that they've never learned before in this design program. The design program is mostly artifact and space, and all of a sudden they're integrating data. Because of my background, I want that to happen. And all of a sudden the complexity becomes so much more relevant for I would say the next generation city, because I'm also an advocate of figuring out how we can live better in the future. And to me, this is one way to make sure that people know that this data is collected and we can learn from it and it can make our lives better.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you. And with that, thank you everyone for attending our panelists. Wonderful different angles to the same question is how can an individual confront information and use it for the public good? And I think you've both acquitted that well in this session. So thank you. And we'll turn it back over to you, Richard.